Okay, so what's up everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is June 30th, 2026, exactly 3:40 a.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 22nd book in our Book to React series, Leon Trotsky's The History of the Russian Revolution. We are in volume 3, in the second chapter of volume 3, if I remember right. Today we will be reading The Problem of Nationalities, chapter 38. Looking forward to it. This is a very important chapter. A chapter so important that honestly I've been thinking about it all day. As you see on my channel in the video section, I've been posting up summaries, AI summaries. Forgive me if you don't like AI, but why not utilize all the innovations that capitalism creates to bring about capitalism's own destruction? So, you know, as I've been reading this book, there have been concepts and themes that I've been wanting to keep up with, and I've been trying to utilize some of the AI tools that I do pay a lot for, to actually help me make more lucid the concepts here. And the concept we're talking about today is very important for Black Americans. It is the topic of self-determination, the rights of minorities within imperial structures, the dissolution of the state, and the freedom of national minorities for their own states to be created, land back, and several other things that are highly, highly important for us as Black Americans. And so that's why I posted up the video earlier today saying that true communists are anti-racist and anti-imperialist. And this is a very important chapter today. Looking forward to reading it. We have both live streams going. We have the horizontal live stream. We have the vertical live stream. Looking forward to reading comments from anybody that jumps in and wants to give commentary on the text or questions I pose. But my first question for today will come before I even start reading the book, because this is a topic I've been thinking about incessantly ever since last year. I read Harry Haywood's book, Black Bolshevik, which you should go check out. And also, as I've continued to learn more and more about Marxist theory and philosophy and radical politics, my first question of the day is, do you believe Black Americans should exercise their rights, fight for their right of self-determination within the United States to create a Black nation, within the United States? Whether we, just take South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, like the people of New Africa have been advocating for many years, or that we carve it up and create something absolutely new. What do you think? What do you think? I have been thinking about this a lot. In fact, most likely I'm going to be writing my thesis about this for my sociology program that I'm graduating from, hopefully, fingers crossed, next year, inshallah. So what do you think about this? Should Black Americans be advocating and fighting for the right for self-determination within the United States? Is something I can't stop thinking about. First question of the day. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Leon Trotsky's chapter 38, The Problem of Nationalities. Language is the most important instrument of human communication and, consequently, of industry. It becomes national together with the triumph of commodity exchange, which integrates nations. Upon this foundation, the national state is erected as the most convenient, profitable, and normal arena for the play of capitalist relations. If you leave out the struggle of the formation, let's read this over again. Let's read this over again because some of you in here are already acting retarded. Okay? We got to put some of you out of here already. All right, continuing here. The problem of nationalities. Language is the most important instrument of human communication and consequently of industry. It becomes national together with the triumph of commodity exchange, which integrates nations. Upon this foundation, the national state is erected as the most convenient, profitable, and normal arena for the play of capitalist relations. In Western Europe, the epoch of the formation of bourgeois nations, if you leave out the struggle of the Netherlands for independence and the fate of the island country, England, began with the Great French Revolution and was essentially completed approximately 100 years later with the formation of the German Empire. But During that period, when in Europe the national state could no longer contain the productive forces and was overgrown into the imperialist state, in the East, in Persia, the Balkans, China, India, the era of national democratic revolutions, taking its impetus from the Russian Revolution of 1905, was only just beginning. The Balkan War of 1912 marked the completion of the forming of national states in southeastern Europe. The subsequent imperialist war completed, incidentally, the unfinished work of the national revolutions in Europe, leading as it did to the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary, the establishment of an independent Poland, and of independent border states cut from the empire of the Tsars. Russia was formed not as a national state, but as a state made up of nationalities. This corresponded to its belated character. On a foundation of extensive agriculture and home industry, commercial capital developed not deeply, not by transforming production, but broadly, by increasing the radius of its operation. The trader, the landlord, and the government official advanced from the center toward the periphery, following the peasant settlers, who, in search of fresh lands and freedom from impost, were penetrating new territory inhabited by still more backward tribes. The expansion of the state was in its foundation an expansion of agriculture, which, with all its primitiveness, showed a certain superiority to that of the nomads in the south and east. The bureaucratic caste state, which formed itself upon this enormous and continually broadening basis, became sufficiently strong to subjugate certain nations in the West, possessed of a higher culture, but unable, because of their small numbers or condition of inner crisis, to defend their independence. Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic states, Finland. So, what Trotsky is saying here is very interesting. He's saying that the nation state is basically bound by people who share the same language, right? He is saying that nations are inherently when people are, all Hungarian speakers, all French speakers, and then slowly over time they build a somewhat coherent community. That coherent community then forms into the nation state, and it is also a way to expand capitalism as well. He ties the growth of the nation state explicitly to the growth of capitalism. But these nation states don't stop growing there. They end up growing to become imperial states. And so he talks about how the European nation states, some of them at least, began to expand across the world. He mentions China, India, the Middle East. He doesn't mention Africa, of course, because that's his blind spot as a white man of his time, but I digress. But he then talks about how, the Balkans were, the final piece of the puzzle where nation states started to develop. And we all know how that turned out. But he talks about Russia differently. Russia, in Trotsky's mind, is similar in development to America in the sense that, not that, Russia imported a large amount of slaves from a foreign land into their territory, but it was a settler colonial project. He didn't have the language for it at the time. He wouldn't say settler colonial, but he was saying that the Russian people continually expanded westward and then conquered the backward tribes and then brought them into the fold, thus making Russia a nation of nationalities, a collection of different peoples of various groups who were basically dominated by a more superior group. There is hints of white supremacy and how he is talking about this, but we have to remember that the language for speaking about colonialism was still in development in the 20th century, and Trotsky is a very, very early revolutionary communist. So this is something we have to keep in mind. But I will continue here. To the 17 million great Russians constituting the main mass of the country, there were gradually added about 90 million outlanders, sharply divided into two groups: the Western peoples excelling Russia in their culture, and the Eastern standing on a lower level. Thus was created an empire of whose population the ruling nationality constituted only 43%. The remaining 57% were nationalities of various degrees of culture and subjugation, including Ukrainians 17%, Poles 6%, white Russians 4.5%. Very interesting what Trotsky is laying out here. He's saying, when he mentions great Russians, by the way, he's basically talking about white Russians. Let's get that understood. When Trotsky says great Russians, he means white Russians. And when he says great Russians, he said that they were a minority in their great country. The white Russians were only 43% of the population, but 57% of the population was essentially a group of subjugated people of various nationalities and histories. Ukrainians, Poles, people from the Baltics, and also the, more Asian tied or identified people that we think about, that also inhabit Russia. So very interesting what Trotsky is laying out here, and very relevant for us in America, because as they say constantly in America, white people in America are becoming a minority. And most likely by the end of my lifetime, white people will be a very small section of America. Now, that is only true if what we imagine to be white now remains the same. I predict that whiteness will continue to expand to the point that white people will even abandon the one-drop rule. You could be, Barack Obama and they'll call you white. You could be Halle Berry and they'll call you white. You could be Mariah Carey and they'll call you white. You get what I'm saying? Like, I imagine that whiteness in its attempts to hold on to power and cling to relevance will continue to expand. So I imagine the Latinos very soon will broadly be cast as white. And we're already seeing that happen now. But this is why I say it's so important for us to read Marxist history, Marxist texts, revolutionary communist texts, because this is highly relevant for us today in America, specifically black people and other racial, ethnic minorities. Very similar. We are living in a situation under white supremacy where literally our economic dependence is upon this white superstructure dependent on capitalism, but also our value is extracted from it. We are essentially at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and that is by design. It's the similar way it was by design in Russia at this time. Sorry for ranting, but this is going to be a very, very important chapter. Shout out to OG Kicks joining the live stream and continuing here. The greedy demands of the state and the meagerness of the peasant foundation under the ruling classes. The greedy demands of the state and the meagerness of the peasant foundation under the ruling classes gave rise to the most bitter forms of exploitation. National oppression in Russia was incomparably rougher than in the neighboring states, not only on its western, but even on its eastern borders. The vast numbers of these nationalities deprived of rights and the sharpness of their deprivation gave to the national problem in Tsarist Russia a gigantic, explosive force. So what Trotsky is saying here, once again, we have to read this in 21st century language. He's essentially saying Russia was hella fucking racist. Russia was institutionally racist against its ethnic minorities. The great Russians had great privileges, and the great Russians were the white Russians. And everybody else who wasn't a great Russian was held back from certain levels of society. And also he makes the comparison to different parts of the world, right? He says that national oppression in Russia was incomparably rougher than in its neighboring states, saying, no different than what we say now, America is way more racist than Mexico. America is way more racist than Canada. And America explicitly has been more racist historically than a lot of other nations. Yes, national oppression or racism exists in Canada or Mexico, but to the degree that it exists, it's incomparable. That's why it's important for us to read this text. I will continue here, trying to translate Trotsky's white mannerisms into language we could understand today. Let's continue here. So, whereas in nationally homogenous states, the bourgeois revolutions developed powerful centripetal tendencies, rallying to the idea of overcoming particularism, as in France, or overcoming national disunion, as in Italy and Germany. In nationally heterogeneous states, on the contrary, such as Turkey, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the belated bourgeois revolution released centrifugal forces. In spite of the apparent contrariness of these processes, when expressed in mechanical terms, their historic function was the same. In both cases, it was a question of using the national unity as a fundamental industrial reservoir. Germany had for this purpose to be united. Austria-Hungary to be divided. Once again, Trotsky is explicitly, this is going to be one of my favorite chapters. Chapter 7 was one of my favorites. I believe like chapter 12 as well was one of my favorites. But chapter 38 is already teeing up to be one of my favorites. Because what is he saying here? He's saying that, other states that were, more homogenous, such as, France, for example, or Italy or Germany, they were trying to unify the people and basically try to tell them to overcome their differences, trying to bring everybody into the fold. But other states, such as Turkey, Russia, Austria-Hungary, because they were more homogenous, the idea was centralizing power around one particular ethnic group for domination over all others. Is this not, once again, very similar to the situation we had in America? You know what I mean? How is this not very similar? So I will continue here. Lenin early learned the inevitability of this development of centrifugal national movements in Russia, and for many years stubbornly fought, most particularly against Rosa Luxemburg, for that famous paragraph 9 of the old party program, which formulated the right of nations to self-determination, that is, to complete separation as states. In this, the Bolshevik Party did not by any means undertake an evangel of separation. It merely assumed an obligation to struggle implacably against every form of national oppression, including the forcible retention of this or that nationality within the boundaries of the general state. Only in this way could the Russian proletariat gradually win the confidence of the oppressed nationalities. Now, this is highly, highly important, and I'm sorry I'm going off on every single paragraph, but this should be the bedrock of why all of us leftists, communists, socialists in general say free Palestine. This is why we advocate for other oppressed minorities to have their nation states. We don't do this just for national chauvinism. We don't make exceptions for other groups of people. We advocate for all people who identify as nations for the right of their nation to exist in a socialist character, not in a bourgeois character, not in an oppressive character. Unfortunately, I have many white supremacists that follow me on my channel, silently, but also they come out of the woodwork whenever I turn on the live, and I quickly execute them, point blank. I saw that recently I had a subscriber who on my channel had memorabilia and videos dedicated to the Confederate flag and the United States secessionist movement of the Confederacy, right? We do not advocate for secessionist movements based upon oppression of another group of people. We would not be advocating for free Palestine if the idea is that, the Palestinians are going to enslave the Jews or something like that. That's not the point. So that's why we are against secessionist movements like the Confederacy. But for people such as enslaved Africans in the South who built the wealth of the Confederacy, yes, we do advocate for those people to have self-determination. That's the point that I think we could all agree on. Also, for the indigenous people of the lands of America, we advocate for their self-determination. Some people, I think many Americans, think that all the natives were essentially exterminated and they all became white, and their names now became Cherokee Adam or or Adam Blackhorn. You get what I'm saying? But that's not the case. There are still many natives in America who want their land back, who have retained their land and continue to advocate for their land, their people, and their nationhood. Very, very important for us. Okay, continuing here. Trotsky says, but that was only one side of the matter. The policy of Bolshevism in the national sphere had also another side, apparently contradictory to the first, but in reality supplementing it. Within the framework of the party and of the workers' organizations in general, Bolshevism insisted upon a rigid centralism, implacably warring against every taint of nationalism which might set the workers one against the other or disunite them. while flatly refusing to the bourgeois states the right to impose compulsory citizenship or even a state language upon a national minority. Bolshevism at the same time made it a verily sacred task to unite as closely as possible, by means of voluntary class discipline, the workers of different nationalities. Thus, it flatly rejected the national federation principle in building the party. A revolutionary organization is not the prototype of the future state, but merely the instrument for its creation. An instrument ought to be adapted to fashioning the product. It ought not to include the product. Thus, a centralized organization can guarantee the success of revolutionary struggle, even where the task is to destroy the centralized oppression of nationalities. So very interesting. What Trotsky is saying here is that when we form our revolutionary groups, like, for example, the Communist Party of the United States, the organization itself is not to try to recreate the state. The party itself is only the instrument to create the new revolutionary state, rather than to be the state in practice. Also, what he lays out that's very, very important is that, we as socialists, as communists, walk a fine line when we say that we advocate for national self-determination for different groups of people. At the same time, it's hard to unite people when we're all in a big group saying that we are advocating for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm here with my Palestinian comrades. I'm here with my Rohingya comrades. I'm here with, my comrades from Northern Ireland, and then, the boss comes out, chairman so-and-so comes out and says, we advocate for independence for Northern Ireland, independence for the Rohingya, and a free Palestine, and a black state, independent black state in the United States. And then, it's hard to unify people for the dictatorship of the proletariat if then all of us have in our mind, damn, I just want to get our state first. Damn, I just want my people to be free first. You get what I'm saying? It's like this really fine tightrope that you have to walk, which I feel like has been the major hurdle for advocating for such a radical policy amongst the left. A lot of us hate disunity, especially amongst the left. It's hard enough to find two Marxists that agree on anything. If you're able to build a whole party around people that agree on at least fundamentals, the last thing you want to do is start dividing them when you bring up, hey, maybe we should advocate for Puerto Rican, national sovereignty and self-determination, or black self-determination in the Deep South. I could easily divide people. You get what I'm saying? But I digress. Let's continue here. For the oppressed nations of Russia, the overthrow of the monarchy inevitably meant also their own national revolution. In this matter, however, we observe the same thing as in all other departments of the February regime. The official democracy, held in leash by its political dependence upon an imperialist bourgeoisie, was totally incapable of breaking the old fetters, holding inviolable its right to settle the fates of all other nations. It continued jealously to guard those sources of wealth, power, and influence which had given the great Russian bourgeoisie its dominant position. The compromisist democracy merely translated traditions of the czarist national policy into the language of libertarian rhetoric. It was now a question of defending the unity of the revolution. But the ruling coalition had also another more pointed argument: wartime expediency. This meant that the aspirations of individual nationalities toward freedom must be portrayed as the work of the Austro-German General Staff. Here, too, the cadets played first violin and the compromisers second. The new government could not, of course, leave absolutely untouched the disgusting legal tangle, the complicated medieval mockeries of the Outlanders, but it did hope and endeavor to stop at a mere annulment of the exceptional laws against individual nations. That is, to establish a bare equality of all parts of the population before the great Russian state bureaucracy. This formal equality gave most of all to the Jews, for the laws limiting their rights had reached the number of 650. Moreover, being city dwellers and the most scattered of all the nationalities, the Jews could make no claim either to state independence or even territorial autonomy. As to the project of so-called national cultural autonomy, which should unite the Jews throughout the whole country around schools and other institutions, this reactionary utopia, borrowed by various Jew groups from the Austrian theoretician Otto Bauer, melted in those first days of freedom like wax under the sun's rays. But a revolution is a revolution for the very reason that it is not satisfied either with doles or deferred payments. The abolition of the more shameful national limitations established a formal equality of citizens regardless of their nationality. But this revealed only the more sharply the unequal position of the nationalities as such, leaving the major part of them in the position of stepchildren, of foster children of the great Russian state. So basically what Trotsky is saying here, when the revolution happened in February and they got rid of Tsar Nicholas, all the racist laws on the books were erased, saying that so-and-so group is not allowed to reach certain levels of power. So Russia became uninstitutionally racist on paper after the February 1917 revolution, but the groups of people who comprised different nations making up Russia were not allowed to seek self-determination. So, continuing here, the proclamation of equal rights meant nothing to the Finns especially, for they did not desire equality with the Russians, but independence of Russia. It gave nothing to the Ukrainians, for their rights had been equal before. They have been forcibly proclaimed to be Russian. It changed nothing in the situation of the Letts and Estonians, oppressed by the German landlord's manor and the Russo-German city. It did not lighten in the least the fate of the backward peoples and tribes of Central Asia, who had been held down to the rock bottom, not by juridical limitations, but by economic and cultural ball and chain. All these questions the liberal compromises coalition refused to even bring up. The democratic state remained the same old state of the great Russian functionary who did not intend to yield his place to anybody. The deeper the revolution sank among the masses in the borderlands, the more clear it became that the Russian state language was there, the language of the possessing classes. The regime of formal democracy, with its freedom of press and assemblage, made the backward and oppressed nationalities only the more painfully aware to what extent they were deprived of the most elementary means of cultural development, their own schools, their own courts, their own officials. Reference to a future constituent assembly only irritated them. They knew well enough that the same party would dominate that assembly, which had created the provisional government, and was continuing to defend the tradition of the Russification, making clear with its jealous greed that line beyond which the ruling classes would not go. Very interesting. So what Trotsky is saying here is that colonialism happened in Russia. The great Russians, the white Russians, essentially forced their language on the people. Russian became the language of high-class society and access. Meanwhile, if you were a Kazakh, for example, or a group from the Altai region of Russia, from the far east, you're seen as less than because your religion, your culture, your language is now considered second class and has no social mobility in this new territory you have been brought into in Russia. So, yeah, once again, Trotsky is saying here that the institutionalization of racism in Russia was not erased by the February Revolution, similar to how in our American timeline, the 1965 Civil Rights Act officially abolished racism on paper in general. Let's just make that clear. But racism, as we know, still continues to exist in America. And so the questions that relate to black wealth, Latino wealth, other groups of people who remain at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in America, the questions are never brought up by the, liberals, particularly the Democrats, and especially by the Republicans, on how to actually address the fundamental issues that maintain a subjugation of different groups of people in America. The same way in Russia at the time, they just essentially said, everybody's equal now. Go do you. There's no reason. There's no reason that you can't succeed now. You get what I'm saying? So I will continue here. Trotsky says, Finland became from the first a thorn in the flesh of the February regime. thanks to the bitterness of the agrarian problem. In Finland, a problem of torpars, that is, small enslaved tenants, the industrial workers, although comprising only 14% of the population, carried the rural population with them. The Finnish Sejm was the only parliament in the world where the Social Democrats got a majority, 103 seats out of 200. Having by their law of June 5th declared the Sejm a sovereign power except on questions of war and foreign policy, the Finnish Social Democrats appealed for support to the Comrade Party of Russia. But their appeal, as it turned out, was sent quite to the wrong address. The provisional government stepped aside at first, permitting the Comrade Party to act. An advisory delegation headed by Trotsky went to Helsingfors and returned empty-handed. Then the socialist ministers of Petrograd, Kerensky, Chernov, Skobelev, Tsetserelli, decided to dissolve by force the socialist government at Helsingfors. The chief of the headquarters staff, the monarchist Lukomsky, gave warning to the civil authorities and the population of Finland that in case of any action against the Russian army, their cities and Helsingfors, first of all, would be laid to waste. After this preparation, the government issued a solemn manifesto, a plagiarism from the monarchy even in its literary style, dissolving the Sejm. And on the first day of the offensive, they placed Russian soldiers withdrawn from the front at the doors of the Finnish parliament. Thus, the revolutionary masses of Russia, making their way to October, got a good lesson on the qualified place occupied by the principles of democracy and a struggle of class force. So essentially what Trotsky is saying here is that, in Finland, which was a territory of the Imperial Russia that still existed, or the territories that still existed, they elected a bunch of social democrats, essentially socialists or far left-wing people. And then what did the Russian liberal government do? Blew up the parliament. They essentially shut that shit down. So for all you people getting excited about Zoran Mamdani, for all you people getting excited about that badass, sexy-ass Dominican who just got elected, Charlize or whatever her name is, don't get your hopes up. Because imagine a full entire cabinet in, the New York State Assembly being full of democratic socialists. What do you think the government would do? Oh, those elections were rigged, buddy. Nope, can't have that. We're going to put New York under martial law. Don't get your hopes up about electoral victories. Let's build mass workers' movements and strong party organs. Okay, I will continue here. Confronted by this unbridled nationalism of the ruling classes, the revolutionary troops in Finland adopted a worthy attitude. A regional congress of the Soviets held in Helsingfors early in September announced, if the Finnish democracy finds it advisable to renew the sessions of the Sejm, any attempt to hinder this will be regarded by the Soviet Congress as a counter-revolutionary act. That was a direct offer of military help. But the Finnish democracy, in which compromises tendencies predominated, was not ready to take the road of insurrection. New elections held under the threat of a new dissolution gave a majority of 108 out of 200 to those bourgeois parties in agreement with whom the government had dissolved the Sejm. Absolutely embarrassing. Going to Kirkham down Stalin, he says the workers' interests will only be represented in full and unabashedly by itself. Shout out to Kirkham down Stalin. But I will ask Kirk this question. This is probably one of the most important chapters because Trotsky is talking about racism, colonialism, and exploitation in a white man's way in 1910. He's the wokest white man in 1917. You get what I'm saying? He's talking about all of the things that we are dealing with as black folks living in, a post-colonial world, but neo-colonial world, and also in a post-institutional, written down, documented racist world in the West. And he's posing that a true socialist, a true communist, should be advocating for national sovereignty and self-determination of nations. So this is something that I've been inching closer and closer to as I continue to read Marxist texts, especially Lenin and Trotsky. I'm inching closer and closer to the idea of advocating for black self-determination in the black belt. Kirkham down Stalin and anybody else who's listening, how do you feel about black self-determination in the black belt? Okay? And for Abby7121, Jesus won't help us with that. Jesus Christ is not going to help us get an independent, free, black, socialist state. So what do we think about that? Because I'm inching closer and closer to that the more I think about it. And I don't want to limit my radical imagination saying, oh no, the white man is so powerful. Oh no, the white man's so strong. Oh no, we can't take nothing from him. I mean, Master's so big and he's so powerful. Nah, fuck that. We could do it. We could do it. Anything is possible. And we shouldn't limit our imagination and our radical dreams. But I digress. I will continue here. Trotsky says, but here, domestic questions come to the front. Questions which in this Switzerland of the North, a land of granite mountains and greedy proprietors, will lead inexorably to civil war. The Finnish bourgeoisie was half openly preparing its military cadres. Secret nuclei of the Red Guard were forming at the same time. The bourgeoisie turned to Sweden and Germany for weapons and instructors. The workers found support in the Russian troops. Meanwhile, in bourgeois circles, yesterday still inclined to agreement with Petrograd, a movement was developing for complete separation from Russia. Their leading newspaper, I am not going to read that Finnish word. What the fuck is that? Look at that word. That word is absolutely insane. That looks like you just took your finger on the keyboard and then smashed your fucking forehead. What the fuck is that? I am not reading that Finnish word. Anyway, the leading Finnish newspaper for the workers, I guess, said, the Russian people are possessed by an anarchist frenzy. Okay, this is not the workers' newspaper. The Russian people are possessed by an anarchist frenzy. Ought we not in these circumstances to separate ourselves as far as possible from that chaos? The provisional government found itself obliged to make concessions without awaiting the Constituent Assembly. On the 23rd of October, a decree was adopted recognizing in principle the independence of Finland, except in military and foreign affairs. But independence given by the hand of Kerensky was not worth much. It was now only 2 days before his fall. So very interesting, very interesting. You know, the Finnish independence movement was being supported by Russian soldiers. Once again, showing why it's so important for us to make, ties with people in the military, because we will need people with military experience to be able to carry out the revolution. All right. Kirkham Down Stalin says, I love the question, the national question, as it were, and I think it needs to be prioritized in America and has been, especially indigenous as well as enslaved populations need autonomy. Absolutely. I'm inching more and more closer to that. The thing that's holding me back from it, the thing that's really holding me back from saying that, national determination for Black Americans and indigenous people is important is simply because in my heart, I've never felt any sort of loyalty or affection for a flag or a concept of a nation, and I don't think I ever can. And I know that's personal, and the political should be separated from the personal in this case, but I just can't imagine, really full-throatedly going out there and saying like, yo, we need a nation. We need a nation. I would feel fake as hell doing that, even though I know theoretically and possibly in praxis it's the right thing to do. And also, I do know that if a real communist vanguard were actually advocating for Black self-determination, because Black people can say we want our own nation all day, but nobody will pay attention until we have white folks saying it, right? And once again, I might be limiting my radical imagination, but I do think there will be an impressive sight of seeing white people out there saying Black people need a homeland, Black people need a state within a state, and I would live in it too. You get what I'm saying? Like, I do think that's very powerful, because that was one of the most powerful mental images that were generated in my mind reading Harry Haywood's book, when he was talking about the Communist Party of the United States had a separate organ that was advocating for Black self-determination, and young white communist members were out there speaking vividly about it in the Deep South at the time. It's something I think about a lot, but it's something that I don't think I could lead, fully. It's not something I don't think I could lead or loudly advocate for. You know what I mean? It's something that I could say I think is essentially right, but it's something that I don't think I could, consistently, just make my main argument for. Does that make sense? I don't know. What do you think? What do you think? Do you think if we advocate for black self-determination, that will get more people? That will get more people on the side of communists, more black people interested in communism, etc., etc. But I digress. So, a second and far more gigantic thorn in the flesh was the Ukraine. Early in June, Kerensky forbade the holding of a Ukrainian Soldier Congress convoked by the Rada. The Ukrainians did not submit. In order to save the face of his government, Kerensky legalized the Congress ex post facto, sending a declamatory telegram, which the assembled deputies greeted with disrespectful laughter. This bitter lesson did not prevent Kerensky from forbidding 3 weeks later a military congress of the Muslims in Moscow. The democratic government seemed anxious to make it plain to the discontented nations, you will get only what you grab. In its first universal issued on June 10th, the Rada, accusing Petrograd of opposing national independence, declared, henceforth, we will build our own life. The cadets denounced the Ukrainian leaders as German agents. The compromisers addressed them with sentimental admonitions. The provisional government sent a delegation to Kiev. In the heated atmosphere of the Ukraine, Kerensky, Tsetserelli, and Tereshchenko felt obliged to take a few steps to meet the Rada. But after the July raids on workers and soldiers, the government veered right on the Ukrainian question also. On August 5th, the Rada, by an overwhelming majority, accused the government, imbued with the imperialist tendencies of the Russian bourgeoisie, of having broken the agreement of July 3rd. When the time came for the government to redeem its pledge, declared the head of the Ukrainian government, Vinnichenko, it turned out that the provisional government is a petty cheat who hopes to get rid of a great historic problem by swindling. This unequivocal language conveys an adequate idea of the authority of the government, even in those circles which ought politically to be rather close to it. For in the long run, the Ukrainian compromiser Vinnichenko was distinguished from Kerensky only as a mediocre novelist from a mediocre lawyer. It is true that in September, the government did finally issue a decree recognizing for all the nationalities of Russia within limits to be designated by the Constituent Assembly the right of self-determination. But this wholly unguaranteed and inwardly contradictory promise for the future, extremely vague in everything but its limitations, inspired no confidence in anybody. The doings of the provisional government were already crying out too loudly against it. On September 2nd, the state, the same body which refused to admit new members without the old uniform, decided to deny publication to the instructions issued to the Ukrainian General Secretariat, that is, to the ministerial cabinet in Kiev, and confirmed by the government. Justification: no law provides for this secretariat, and it is impossible to issue instructions to an illegal institution. The lofty jurist did not conceal the fact either that the very agreement entered into between the government and the Rada was a usurpation of the rights of the Constituent Assembly. These czarist senators, having now become the most inflexible partisans of pure democracy, in this show of courage, the oppositionists from the right were risking nothing at all. They knew that their opposition was quite after the heart of the ruling classes. Although the Russian bourgeoisie had swallowed a certain amount of independence for Finland, united to Russia as she was by weak economic ties, it could not possibly agree to an autonomy of Ukrainian grain, Donetsk coal, and the ores of Kryvyi. On October 19th, Kerensky sent a telegraph order to the General Secretary of the Ukraine to come promptly to Petrograd for personal explanations in regard to a criminal agitation started there in favor of a Ukrainian Constituent Assembly. At the same time, the district attorney of Kiev was directed to begin an investigation of the Rada. But these threats gave as little fright to the Ukraine as the acts of grace had given joy to Finland. The Ukrainian compromisers were at this time feeling infinitely more secure than their elder cousins in Petrograd. Aside from the auspicious atmosphere surrounding the struggle for national rights, the comparative stability of the petty bourgeois parties in the Ukraine, as also in a number of other oppressed nations, had economic and social roots describable in one word: backwardness. In spite of the swift industrial development of the Donetsk and Kryvyi basins, the Ukraine as a whole continued to lag behind Great Russia. The Ukrainian proletariat was less homogeneous, less tempered. The Bolshevik Party was weak, both in numbers and quality, had been slow in breaking away from the Mensheviks, and was poorly vested in the political and especially the national situation. Even in the industrial eastern parts of the Ukraine, a regional conference of the Soviets as late as the middle of October showed a slight compromisist majority. The Ukrainian bourgeoisie was comparatively still weaker. One of the causes of the social instability of the Russian bourgeoisie, taken as a whole, lay, we remember, in the fact that its more powerful section consisted of foreigners not even dwelling in Russia. In the borderlands, this fact was supplemented by another, no less significant. Their own domestic bourgeoisie did not belong to the same nation as the principal mass of people. Once again, another large similarity to America. As we know, many of the people that got rich from slavery in America were not even Americans. This was coal. There was coal extracted from the mountains of Birmingham and Alabama to, of course, the cotton that was extracted off the soil in the Deep South. And that built up the wealth of, for example, the UK. For example, France. For example, many other Western European nations. The mineral resources and the extracted surplus value from the labor of enslaved Africans created the wealth of the Americas. So what Trotsky is saying here is that, once again, there was a minority of people in Russia who are not of the same nation, and we can extend that to race, who were getting rich off of the wealth and labor extracted from people not like them. You get what I'm saying? Very, very important for us to keep in mind. So continuing here. The population of the cities in these borderlands was completely different in its national ingredients from the population of the country. In the Ukraine and White Russia, the landlord, capitalist, lawyer, journalist was a Great Russian, a Pole, a Jew, a foreigner. The rural population was wholly Ukrainian and White Russian. In the Baltic states, the cities were havens of the German, Russian, and Jewish bourgeoisie. The country was altogether Lettish and Estonian. In the cities of Georgia, a Russian and Armenian population predominated, as also in Turkish Azerbaijan, being separated from the fundamental mass of the people not only by their level of life and culture, but also by language, as are the English in India, being indebted for the protection of their possessions and income to the bureaucratic machine, and being closely bound up with the ruling classes of all other countries. The landlords, industrialists, and merchants in these borderlands grouped around themselves a narrow circle of Russian functionaries, clerks, teachers, physicians, lawyers, journalists, and to some extent workers also, converting the cities into centers of Russification and colonization. So once again, what Trotsky is talking about here is something very similar to what happens in our timeline. When we think about Dubai, Miami, London, Paris, many of the major economic centers of the world, what are they all filled with? Mega rich people. Mega rich people that trade passports like they trade Pokemon cards, have multiple nationalities, and can easily switch from city to city in a single week, live in all single city every single day of the week. You get what I'm saying? And what do they have in common? They typically are not like the people that live in that town. They get wealth from the people that live in these major cities. And they're tied together by a colonial language. In this case, in our timeline, English. Right? I'm a part of that too. I gentrify a lot of neighborhoods. I done gentrify like 3 or 4 countries at this point. You know what I'm saying? In all the places I've lived in. And I tend to live a very good life. You know what I mean? Most Hungarians, where I'm at right now, can't afford to live in an apartment like this, by themselves and basically, continue to feed themselves and not have to struggle for money. You get what I'm saying? Though life is hard for me, it's better than the average Hungarian. Why? Because I have ties to the empire. I recognize my privilege. I wish more white people could do that, but I digress. He's saying here that at the time, in different parts of the Russian Empire, there was a Russian sort of gentrification happening. Rich Russians and also, Polish people, Jews, other foreigners would move into these imperial centers of capital within the Russian Empire and just make bank. And who are they exploiting? The basic people that live there. This is the first immigration crisis. I know right now a lot of people are pissed off because poor brown people are moving into European nations. But the first immigration crisis and the current immigration crisis is really the immigration of rich foreign business people who basically can buy citizenship, not give a fuck about the culture, the language, the history of any nation, and essentially extract wealth from the people that live there. And tell those people that live there who are seeing their living conditions and working standards decrease that the problem is not them, the rich billionaire that just bought Austrian citizenship. It's the brown Muslim man that came in. You get what I'm saying? But I digress. The three-tooth, redneck, MAGA idiots aren't even going to hear that. I digress. Let's continue here. It was possible to ignore the villages so long as they remained silent. When they began, however, more and more impatiently to lift their voices, the city resisted and stubbornly continued to resist, defending its privileged position. The functionary, the merchant, the lawyer soon learned to disguise his struggle to retain the commanding heights of industry and culture under the form of a top-lofty condemnation of an increasing chauvinism. The desire of a ruling nation to maintain the status quo frequently dresses up as superiority to nationalism, just as the desire of a victorious nation to hang on to its booty easily takes the form of pacifism. Thus, MacDonald, in the face of Gandhi, feels as though he were an internationalist. Thus, too, the gravitation of the Austrians toward Germany appears to Poincaré as an offense against French pacifism. People living in the cities of the Ukraine, so wrote a delegation of the Rada to the provisional government in May, see before them the Russified streets of these cities and completely forget that the cities are only little islets in the sea of the whole Ukrainian people. When Rosa Luxemburg, in her posthumous polemic against the program of the October Revolution, asserted that Ukrainian nationalism, having been formerly a mere amusement of the commonplace petty bourgeois intelligentsia, had been artificially raised up by the yeast of the Bolshevik formula of self-determination, she fell, notwithstanding her luminous mind, into a very serious historic error. So what Trotsky is saying here is that basically Rosa Luxemburg is making the Putin argument. Rosa Luxemburg said that Ukrainian nationalism, the idea that Ukraine should be a free, independent nation, was not something that the average, yokel in Ukraine thought about. This was a petty bourgeois revolution. It was basically, the rich kids and their rich fathers having, whiskey and cigars late at night saying, wouldn't it be great if we got to oppress our own people instead of, the Russians, oppressing us and making us all rich? Wouldn't it be great? That's essentially a petty bourgeois revolution, right? And Trotsky disagrees with that. He does believe in some type of Ukrainian nationalism, that the Ukrainians are a distinct people from Russians. It'd be very interesting. It would be insanely interesting to see Rosa Luxemburg and Leon Trotsky debate the current Russian-Ukrainian war now. If I could bring two people back to life right now and talk with them, I would just tell Trotsky and Rosa, Russia and Ukraine have been at war since 2020. 2022 has been so long, and just have them go at it. Anyway, I will digress here. All right. The Ukrainian peasantry had not made national demands in the past, for the reason that the Ukrainian peasantry had not, in general, risen to the height of political being. The chief service of the February Revolution, perhaps its only service, but one amply sufficient, lay exactly in this, that it gave the oppressed classes and nations of Russia at last an opportunity to speak out. This political awakening of the peasantry could not have taken place otherwise, however, than through their own native language, with all the consequences ensuing in regard to schools, courts, self-administration. To oppose this would have been to try to drive the peasants back into non-existence. The difference in nationality between the cities and the villages was painfully felt also in the Soviets, they being predominantly city organizations. Under the leadership of the compromise parties, the Soviets would frequently ignore the national interests of the basic population. This was one cause of the weakness of the Soviets in Ukraine. The Soviets of Riga and Reval forgot about the interest of the Lets and the Estonians. The compromisist Soviets in Baku scorned the interest of the basic Turkoman population. Under a false banner of internationalism, the Soviets would frequently wage a struggle against the defensive nationalism of the Ukrainians or Muslims, supplying a screen for the oppressive Russifying movement of the cities. A little time after, under the rule of the Bolsheviks, the Soviets of these borderlands began to speak the language of the villages. Their general economic and cultural primitiveness did not permit the Siberian outlanders, kept down as they were both by nature and exploitation, to rise even to that level where national aspirations begin. Vodka, taxes, and compulsory orthodoxy were here from time immemorial the principal instruments of statehood. Very interesting. It took us going to page, 853 for a Russian man to mention vodka once. I can't believe it. We finally found vodka in the text, boys. Take a shot. Take a shot. Anyway. Vodka, taxes, and compulsory orthodoxy were here from time immemorial the principal instruments of statehood. That disease, which the Italians called the French evil, and the French the Napolitan, was called Russian by the Siberian peoples. That shows from what sources came the seeds of civilization. The February Revolution did not reach that far. The hunters and reindeer breeders of the polar waste must still wait long for their dawn. The people and tribes along the Volga, in the northern Caucasus, in Central Asia, awakened for the first time out of their prehistoric existence by the February Revolution, had as yet neither national bourgeoisie nor national proletariat. Above the peasant or shepherd mass, a thin layer had detached itself from among the upper strata, constituting an intelligentsia, not yet rising to a program of national self-administration. The struggle here was about matters like having their own alphabet, their own teachers, even at times their own priest. In these ways, the most oppressed were being compelled to learn in bitter experience that the educated masters of the state would not voluntarily permit them to rise in the world. The most backward of the backward were thus compelled to seek the most revolutionary class as an ally. Through the left elements of their young intelligentsia, the Voityaks, the Chuvashes, the Syrians, the tribes of Dagestan and Turkestan began to find their way toward the Bolsheviks. The fate of the colonial possessions, especially in Central Asia, would change together with the industrial evolution of the center, passing from direct and open robbery, including trade robbery, to those more disguised methods which converted the Asiatic peasants into suppliers of industrial raw material, chiefly cotton. Hierarchically organized exploitation, combining the barbarity of capitalism with the barbarity of patriarchal life, successfully held down the Asiatic peoples in extreme national abasement. And here the February regime left everything as it was. The best lands seized under Tsarism from the Bakshirs, Buryats, Kyrgyz, and other nomadic tribes had continued in the possession of the landlords and wealthy Russian peasants scattered about in colonizing oases among the native population. The awakening of a national spirit of independence here meant first of all a struggle against these colonizers, who had created an artificial strip system of land ownership and condemned the nomads to hunger and gradual extinction. The colonizers, on their side, furiously defended the unity of Russia, that is, the sanctity of their grabbings, against the separatism of the Asiatics. The hatred of the colonizers for the native movements assumed zoological forms in the Transbaikal. Pogroms of the Buryats were in full swing under the leadership of March social revolutionaries, recruited from village clerks and non-commissioned officers returning from the front. In their anxiety to preserve the old order as long as possible, all the exploiters and violators in the colonized regions appealed henceforth to the sovereign rights of the Constituent Assembly. This phraseology was supplied them by the provisional government, which had found here its surest bulwark. On the other hand, the privileged upper circles of the oppressed peoples were also calling more and more often on the name of the Constituent Assembly. Even the Muslim clergy, who would lift above the awakening mountain peoples and the tribes of the northern Caucasus the green banner of the Shariat, whenever a pressure from below made their position difficult, were now postponing the question until the Constituent Assembly. This became the slogan of conservatism, of reaction, of special interest and privilege all over the country. To appeal to the Constituent Assembly meant to postpone and gain time. Postponement meant assemble your forces and strangle the revolution. So once again, I think Trotsky is making a very compelling argument here that counter-revolution is not only against, the working class. I would say it's primarily against the working class, but it's also to strangle, to kill any sort of idea of a people gaining national sovereignty, of a people actually being able to have self-determination. It's twofold, right? Shout out to Stan Wati. He says, get the ice pick pro. Okay, listen, man, I'm not a Trotskyist. Shout out to Stan Wati, but I want everyone to know I am not a Trotskyist. But I enjoy Trotsky's work. All right, just letting you know, Stan Wati and anybody else up in the live stream, we enjoy Trotsky's work, but that does not mean we endorse everything Trotsky said or believed. You get what I'm saying? But it's interesting that the man who talked about permanent revolution as a way to dissolve borders might be the one to push me over the edge to say that black people need an independent nation, socialist state. The Free People's Republic of what? The Cackalax? What state do we want? What state do we want, by the way? Would we be happy with just South and North Carolina? Would that be all it take? The U.S. wouldn't be missing much except the Research Triangle. I'm just saying, man. I'm just saying. Anyway, continuing here. The leadership fell into the hands of the clergy or feudal gentry, however, only at first, only among the backward peoples, almost only among the Muslims. In general, the national movement in the villages was headed as a matter of course by rural teachers, village clerks, functionaries and officers of low rank, and to some extent merchants, alongside the Russian or Russianized intelligentsia, composed of the more respectable and well-provided elements. There was formed in the borderland cities another layer, a younger layer, closely bound up with its village origin and lacking access to the banquet of capital. And this layer naturally took upon itself the task of representing politically the national and in part also the social interests of the basic peasant mass. Although hostilely disposed to the Russian compromisers along the line of this national aspiration, these borderland compromisers belonged to the same fundamental type, and even for the most part went by the same name. The Ukrainian social revolutionaries and social democrats, the Georgian and Lettish Mensheviks, the Lithuanian Trudoviks tried, like their great Russian namesake, to confine the revolution within the framework of the bourgeois regime. But the extreme weakness of the native bourgeoisie here compelled the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, instead of entering a coalition, to take the state power into their own hands. Compelled to go farther on agrarian and labor questions than the central government, these borderland compromisers had also the great advantage of being able to appear before the army and the country as opponents of the coalition provisional government. All this was sufficient, if not to create different destinies for the Russian compromisers and those of the borderlands, at least to give a different tempo to their rise and fall. Very interesting what Trotsky is saying here. He's saying that, the national groups that wanted self-determination had their own socialist in name only. They had their own Mensheviks. They had their own, social revolutionaries who literally were not trying to overthrow the capitalist system, but were trying to placate the bourgeoisie and strangle the revolution before it reached its full conclusion. And because they were outsiders, because these are people who are supposedly oppressed by the great Russian state, they look like they're opposing. They look like they're on the far left. And is that not also very similar to how we have black politicians, primarily in the Democrats, who pretend to be far leftists just because of their blackness? I think of, Raphael Warnock or Barack Obama, etc., right? People that, just by their character, you would expect them to be further left than they actually are, which they are not. And that's because of the outsider thing. And this is something that we have to This is something that we have to consider as we continue to analyze our current predicament and also apply the knowledge that Trotsky is dropping in this text to our current situation. I will continue here. The Georgian Social Democrats not only led after them the pauper peasantry of Little Georgia, but also laid claim, and that not without success, to lead the movement of the revolutionary democracy for all Russia. During the first months of the revolution, the heads of the Georgian intelligentsia regarded Georgia not as a national fatherland, but as a Gironde, a blessed southern province called to provide leaders for the whole country. At the Moscow State Conference, one of the prominent Georgian Mensheviks, Chenkeli, boasted that the Georgians had always said, even under Tsarism, in fair weather and foul, a single fatherland, Russia. What shall we say of the Georgian nation? Cried this same Chenkeli a month later at the Democratic Conference. It is wholly at the service of the great Russian Revolution. And it is quite true that the Georgian compromisers, like the Jewish, were always at the service of the great Russian bureaucracy, when it was necessary to moderate or put brakes on the national claims of individual regions. This continued only so long, however, as the Georgian Social Democrats still hoped to confine the revolution within the framework of bourgeois democracy. In proportion as the danger appeared of a victory of the masses led by Bolshevism, the Georgian Social Democrats relaxed their ties with the Russian compromisers and united closely with the reactionary elements of Georgia itself. The moment the Soviets were victorious, these Georgian partisans of a single Russia became the trumpeters of separation and showed to the other peoples of Transcaucasia the yellow fangs of their chauvinism. This inevitable national disguise of social contradictions, less developed in the borderlands anyway, as a general rule, adequately explains why the October Revolution was destined to meet more opposition in most of the oppressed nations than in Central Russia. But on the other hand, the conflict of nationalities by its very nature cruelly shook the February regime and created sufficient favorable surroundings for the revolution in the center. Very interesting. So if I'm understanding right, Trotsky is saying that, when the Soviets eventually come to power and create the largest, nation that ever existed, if you want to call it such, the Soviet Union, which had, multiple member states, particularly in the Caucasus region, he's saying that, those areas resisted primarily because they felt like they were on their way to self-determination when, these bourgeois people showed up and started advocating for national determination. And then here come these Soviets saying that, we're here to install the worker state of the Soviets and, the power to the people. And the people probably resisted because they thought that they were closer to national determination. Very interesting how Trotsky frames it. It's a very interesting take. If people gain national self-determination on a bourgeois form, is that sufficient enough to suppress it and then replace it with the proletarian? I mean, it's like saying, it's like how the white man says, if it weren't for enslaving Africans, you wouldn't know Jesus. You wouldn't know Jesus and you wouldn't know English. And what would you be without Jesus and English? It's very similar. It's very similar, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. But I will continue here. In these circumstances, the national antagonisms, whenever they coincided with class contradictions, became especially hot. The age-old hostility between the Lettish peasants and the German barons impelled many thousands of laboring Letts to volunteer at the outbreak of the war. The sharpshooting regiments of Lettish farmhands and peasants were among the best troops at the front. As early as May, however, they had already come out for a Soviet government. Their nationalism was only the outer shell of an immature Bolshevism. A like process took place in Estonia. In White Russia, with its Polish or Polized landlords, its Jewish population in the cities and small towns, and its Russian officials, the twice and thrice oppressed peasantry had some time before October, under the influence of the nearby front, poured its national and social indignation into the channel of Bolshevism. In the elections for the Constituent Assembly, the overwhelming mass of White Russians would cast its vote for the Bolsheviks. All these processes in which an awakened national dignity was linked up with social indignation, now holding it back, now pushing it forward, found an extremely sharp expression in the army. Here there was a veritable fever for creating national regiments, and there were at one time patronized, at another tolerated, at still another persecuted by the central government, according to their attitude to the war and the Bolsheviks. But in general, they kept growing more and more hostile to Petrograd. Lenin kept a firm hand on the national pulse of the revolution. In a famous article, The Crisis is Ripe, written toward the end of September, he insistently pointed out that the National Courier of the Democratic Conference had stood second in the matter of radicalism, yielding only to the trade unions and standing higher than the Soviet Courier in its percentage of votes against the coalition, 40 out of 55. This meant that the oppressed people were no longer hoping for any benefit from the great Russian bourgeoisie. They were more and more trying to get their rights by independent action, a bite at a time, and in the form of revolutionary seizures. In an October Congress of the Buryats in the far-off Verkhnudsk, a speaker declared that the February Revolution introduced nothing new, in the position of the outlander. His summing up of the situation made it seem necessary, if not yet to take the side of the Bolsheviks, at least to observe an attitude of more and more friendly neutrality toward them. An all-Ukrainian soldier congress, which met during the very days of the Petrograd insurrection, adopted a resolution to struggle against the transfer of power to the Ukrainian Soviet, but at the same time refused to regard the insurrection of the great Russian Bolsheviks as an anti-democratic action, and promised to take all measures to prevent the soldiers being sent to put down the insurrection. This equivocation, which perfectly characterizes the petty bourgeois stage of the national struggle, facilitated the revolution of the proletariat, which intended to put an end to all equivocations. On the other hand, the bourgeois circles in the borderlands, which had heretofore invariably and always gravitated toward the central power, now launched into a separatism, which in many cases no longer had a shred of national foundation. The Baltic bourgeoisie, which only yesterday had been following in a state of hurrah patriotism the German barons, the first bulwark of the Romanovs, took its stand in the struggle against Bolshevik Russia and its own masses under the banner of separatism. Still more curious phenomena appeared along the road. On the 20th of October, the foundations were laid for a new state formation, the Southeastern Union of the Cossack troops, Caucasian mountaineers and free peoples of the steppes. Here, the leaders of the Don, Kuban, Tyre, and Astrakhan Cossacks, the chief bulwark of imperial centralism, were transformed in the course of a few months into a passionate defenders of the federal principle, and united on the grounds with the leaders of the Muslim mountaineers and steppe dwellers. The boundaries of the federative structure were to serve as a barrier against the Bolshevik danger coming from the north. However, before creating the principal drill ground for the civil war against the Bolsheviks, this counter-revolutionary separatism went directly against the ruling coalition, demoralizing and weakening it. Thus, the national problem, along with all others, showed the provisional government a Medusa's head on which every hair of the March and April hopes had changed into a snake of hate and indignation. It's fascinating how Trotsky has been laying this down. I appreciate UserGamer995. Thank you. Thank you for the compliments over here. UserGamer995 for saying I'm doing well. All peoples have a right to self-determination, says Super Kripke. Shout out to Super Kripke for dropping his little gems. So Super Kripke, I ask you a direct question. And you know when I ask somebody a direct question, I expect them to answer it. Super Kripke, should Black Americans have the right to self-determination in the United States of America? Do you think it is right for Black Americans, and I know we can't talk about Black Americans without pulling other people in it, and most likely, Super Kripke, you're a white person, so I'm going to make this question palatable for white people as well. Should indigenous people in the Americas have land back to create their own independent, fully sovereign, socialist nations? And also, should Black Americans have the right to self-determination? This is a question that no white man can ever lie to resist. You know, one of the powers of being a white supremacist, a racist, in general, is that they can lie with no shame. But white people cannot lie when it comes to their disdain for black people to have rights and freedom. So Super Kripke, I ask you one more time, do you think black Americans should have the right to self-determination to create a socialist, free, sovereign state in the United States? The white people cannot lie their way out of that one. A real white man will answer in a way that I think all of us know the way he will answer. But I digress. All right, a further note on the problem of nationalities. The Bolshevik Party did not by any means immediately after the February Revolution adopt the attitude of the national question, which in the long run guaranteed its victory. This was true not only in the borderlands with their weak and inexperienced party organizations, but also in the Petrograd center. During the war, the party had so weakened, the theoretical and political level of its cadres had become so lowered that on the national question too, its official leaders took an extremely confused and halfway position until the arrival of Lenin. To be sure, following their tradition, the Bolsheviks defended the right of a nation to self-determination. But the Mensheviks also subscribed to this formula in words. The text of the two programs remained identical. It was the question of power which was decisive, and the temporary leaders of the party proved wholly incapable of understanding the irreconcilable antagonism between the Bolshevik slogans on the national as well as the agrarian question, and the preservation of a bourgeois imperialistic regime, even though disguised in democratic forms. The democratic position found its most crass expression from the pen of Stalin. On March 25th, in an article dealing with a government decree on the abolition of national limitations. Okay, there's a typo here. Has to be government decree. Anyway, the democratic position found its most crass expression from the pen of Stalin. Here comes Trotsky throwing shots at Stalin again. On March 25th, in an article, we have to send some people out of here immediately. Don't you ever come back here. The democratic position found its most crass expression from the pen of Stalin. On March 25th, in an article dealing with a government decree on the abolition of national limitations, Stalin tried to formulate the national question on a historic scale. The social basis of national oppression, he writes, the power inspiring it, is a decaying land aristocracy. The fact that national oppression developed unprecedentedly during the epoch of capitalism and found its most barbaric expression in colonial policies seems to be beyond the ken of the democratic author. Okay, basically, Trotsky's saying Stalin is kind of stupid because Stalin said that the social basis of national oppression goes back to a land aristocracy. Basically, rich people owned land a long time ago, and they oppressed different nationalities that lived on that land, I guess, supposedly. But Trotsky is saying, nations developed during the age of the Industrial Revolution into their full form. You know what I'm saying? Nations started to develop, very, very recently and began to crystallize. And, the nation state is a real hard invention that came in the late 18th, and all throughout the 19th century, I guess. But I digress. Continuing here. The fact that national oppression developed unprecedentedly during the epoch of capitalism and found its most barbaric expression in colonial policies seems to be beyond the ken of the democratic author. In England, he continues, where the landed aristocracy shares the power with the bourgeoisie, where the unlimited power of this aristocracy long ago ceased to exist, national oppression is milder, less inhumane, leaving out of account, of course, the circumstance that during the course of the war, when the power had gone over into the hands of the landlords, national oppression was considerably strengthened, persecution of Ireland and India. Those guilty of oppressing Ireland and India are the landlords, who evidently, in the person of Lord George, have seized the power thanks to the war. In Switzerland and North America, continues Stalin, where there is no landlordism and never has been, where the power is undivided in the hands of the bourgeoisie, nationalities have developed freely. National oppression, generally speaking, finds no place. The author completely forgets the Negro, Indian, immigrant, and colonial problems in the United States. So this is the first time Trotsky has mentioned black people specifically. Basically what Stalin is saying is very particular to the United Kingdom, where a landed aristocracy was able to maintain power along with the rise of the bourgeoisie to some degree. And that sort of formed this weird fusion of the bourgeoisie and the landed gentry, which is why in the UK today you still have like the House of Lords. They have a group of unelected people who basically are in power in politics, specifically because their grandfather 500 years ago killed a dragon or some shit. Basically, Trotsky is saying, think about the Negroes, Indians, immigrants, and colonial problems in the United States. These are totally different circumstances of national oppression than the one that you're talking about in the UK. But I digress. All right. From this hopelessly provincial analysis, which comes only to a confused contrasting of feudalism with democracy, purely liberal political inferences are drawn. To remove the feudal aristocracy from the political scene, to snatch the power from it, that is exactly the same thing as to put an end to the national oppression, to create the actual conditions necessary for national freedom. Insofar as the Russian Revolution has conquered, writes Stalin, it has actually created these conditions. We have here perhaps a more principled apology for the imperialist democracy than all that has been written on this theme by the Mensheviks. Just as in foreign policy, Stalin, along with Kamenev, hoped to achieve a democratic peace by means of a division of labor with the provisional government, so in domestic policy he found in the democracy of Prince Lvov the actual conditions of national freedom. As a matter of fact, the fall of the monarchy first fully exposed the fact that not only the reactionary landlords, but also the whole liberal bourgeoisie, and following after it the whole petty bourgeois democracy, along with the patriotic upper crust of the working class, was implacably hostile to a genuine equality of national rights. That is to say, an abolition of the privileges of the dominant nation. Their whole program came down to a business of mitigation, of cultural sugarcoating, of democratic concealment of the great Russian ascendancy. At the April conference, in defending Lenin's resolution on the national question, Stalin formally starts from the thesis that national oppression is the system, those measures which are adopted by the imperialist circles. But he straight away and inevitably gets off the track and goes back to his March position. The more democratic a country, the weaker its national oppression, and vice versa. Such is the speaker's own summary, and not the one he borrowed from Lenin. The fact that democratic England is oppressing feudal and caste-ridden India escapes, as before, from his limited field of vision. In distinction from Russia, where an old land aristocracy has dominated, continues Stalin, in England and Austria, Hungary, the national oppression has never taken the form of pogroms. As though a land aristocracy never dominated in England, and as though it does not dominate to this day in Hungary. The combined character of historic development, which unites social democracy with the strangling of weak nations, had remained for Stalin a sealed book. I want this point to be very important to every person of color who is listening right now. Because most likely, who would you agree with if you were back around that time, or if you're reading this now? Stalin, who is saying that the more democratic a country, the less oppressive it is to national minorities. Or Trotsky, who is saying, how the fuck can Western nations be called democratic when they literally have colonies, slave colonies? They literally have the entire Indian subcontinent in chains. They literally have slave colonies in the Caribbean. At the same time, while their men, only their men, had suffrage. This is the thing. Most likely, who would you agree with, Lenin or Trotsky? This is why I think it's silly for us communists in general to say, I'm a Stalinist, or I'm a Leninist, I'm a Marxist, Maoist, third worldist, I disavow Trotsky, or the vice versa, saying Trotsky is the only real fucking communist there was, man. Like, no. Like, bro, we can draw from all of them, because Stalin is absolutely wrong in this case. Stalin is absolutely wrong, and most likely, going back full circle, when I said I'm addressing this to people of color who consider themselves on the left, most likely we would say, hell yeah, that doesn't make sense. How the fuck can we call France democratic and free when they had half of Africa in colonies, in chains, without rights? How can we say that? No. Look at Trotsky being post-colonial. Proto-post-colonial. Because there's still some flaws in his outlook. You know what I'm saying? But still, it's better than Stalin's bullshit. Continuing here. So, that Russia took form as a state made up of nationalities is the result of her historic belatedness. But belatedness is a complex conception, inevitably contradictory. The backward country does not follow in the tracks of the advanced, keeping the same distance. In an epoch of worldwide economy, the backward nations becoming involved under pressure from the advanced in the general chain of development skip over a whole series of intermediate stages. Moreover, the absence of firmly established social forms and traditions makes the backward country, at least within certain limits, extremely hospitable to the last word in international technique and international thought. Backwardness does not, however, for this reason, cease to be backwardness. The whole development gets a contradictory and combined character. A predominance of historic extremes is proper to the social structure of a belated nation. Predominance of the backward peasants and the advanced proletarians over the intermediate formations of the bourgeoisie. The tasks of one class are shouldered off upon another. In the national sphere also, the uprooting of medieval remnants falls to the lot of the proletariat. Nothing so clearly characterizes the historic belatedness of Russia when considered as a European country as the fact that in the 20th century she had to liquidate compulsory land rent and the Pale, those twin barbarisms, serfdom, and the ghetto. But in performing these tasks, Russia, exactly because of her belated development, made use of new and utterly modern classes, parties, programs. To make an end of the idea and methods of Rasputin, she required the ideas and methods of Marx. Political practice remained, of course, far from primitive than political theory, for things are harder to change than ideas. But theory, nevertheless, only carried the demands of practical action clear through. In order to achieve liberation and a cultural lift, the oppressed nationalities were compelled to link their fate with that of the working class. And for this, they had to free themselves from the leadership of their own bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties. They had to make a long spurt forward, that is, on the road of historic development. Okay? So very, very interesting here what Trotsky is saying. He is saying that, many people who were a part of the working class are initially interested, especially if they are a part of an oppressed minority, to the thoughts, to the ideas, to the dreams of national liberation. If we think about in the American context, one of the most popular African-American movements in history was Marcus Garvey's movement. The idea that we're all going to go back to Africa and create an independent black nation, and that, white people and black people essentially will never be able to get along. Never mind the fact that Marcus Garvey was a capitalist and he was seeking to try to recreate the exploitative capitalist structure in Africa. Once again, a petty bourgeois revolution is just when rich people say, wouldn't it be great if we could fuck over people that look like us? Instead of other people fucking over our people and we just get, a good chunk of money for it. That's essentially a bourgeois revolution, okay? So, Trotsky is saying that a bourgeois revolution in these underdeveloped parts of the world where the bourgeois are not actually as developed as they need to be to stage that revolution so that they can fuck their own people in the ass. He said, essentially, we're going to do this instead. The proletariat said we're going to go with the people who are advocating for full-on national sovereignty, okay? So, once again, the question for the people in the audience who are just now joining, if we agree that all people deserve self-determination, do black Americans, and because this is a mostly white audience and nothing can be spoke about solely in the terms of black folks, should indigenous people and black people have the right to self-determination to create a socialist, independent, free, sovereign state within the confines of what we call now the United States? Continuing here. This subordination of the national movements to the fundamental process of the revolution, the struggle of the proletariat for power, was not accomplished at once, but in several stages, and moreover differently in different regions. The Ukrainian, White Russian, the Tatar workers, peasants, and soldiers who were hostile to Kerensky, the war, and the Russification became thereby, in spite of their compromisist leadership, allies of the proletarian insurrection. From being an objective support of the Bolsheviks, they became obliged at a further stage to go over consciously also to the Bolshevik road. In Finland, Latvia, and Estonia, and more weakly in the Ukraine, the stratification of the national movement had taken such sharp forms by October that only the interference of foreign troops could prevent the success of the proletarian revolution. In the Asiatic East, where the national awakening was taking place in more primitive forms, it could only by degrees and with a considerable lag come under the leadership of the proletariat. Only, indeed, after the proletariat had conquered the power. If you take this complicated and contradictory process as a whole, the conclusion is obvious. The national current, like the agrarian, was pouring into the channel of the October Revolution. The irrevocable and irresistible going over of the masses from the most rudimentary tasks of political, agrarian, and national emancipation and abolition of serfdom to the slogan of proletarian rulership resulted not from demagogic agitation, not from preconceived schemes, not from the theory of permanent revolution as the liberals and compromisers thought, but from the social structure of Russia and the conditions of the worldwide situation. The theory of permanent revolution only formulated the combined process of this development. Very interesting. So this is another part where Trotsky is going to talk explicitly about his theory of permanent revolution. I did not expect that to be brought up in this text. We have quite a few pages left to go. I'm going to continue right here, but we might take a little break at a certain point when we reach the final section of the text, okay? So, it is a question here, not of Russia alone. This subordination of belated national revolutions to the revolution of the proletariat follows a law which is valid throughout the world. Whereas in the 19th century, the fundamental problem of wars and revolutions was still to guarantee a national market to the productive forces. The problem of our century is to free the productive forces from the national boundaries, which have become iron fetters upon them. In the broad historic sense, the national revolutions of the East are only stages of the world revolution of the proletariat, just as the national movements of Russia become stepping stones to the Soviet dictatorship. So, very, very interesting here what Trotsky is saying. This is him explicitly laying out his argument for permanent revolution. And I am not a Trotskyist because I believe, from what I know of Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution, it's not something I agree with. But if essentially at its core, it's something that I think all of us Marxists, socialists, communists agree with. That essentially we are not free until we're all free. You know what I'm saying? As long as capitalism still exists anywhere in the world, even if our individual nations become socialist in nature or are building towards socialism, anywhere capitalism exists, it threatens our existence. You get what I'm saying? So that's essentially what Trotsky laid out here in this first paragraph. The Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution is only the beginning of a larger revolution against capitalist forces. Continuing here. Lenin appraised with admirable profundity the revolutionary force inherent in the development of the oppressed nationalities, both in Tsarist Russia and throughout the world. That hypocritical pacifism, which condemns in the same way the war of Japan against China, aiming at her enslavement, and the war of China against Japan in the cause of her liberation, got nothing but scorn from Lenin. For him, a war of national liberation, in contrast to wars of imperialistic oppression, was merely another form of the national revolution in its turn enters as a necessary link in the liberating struggle of the international working class. Let's read this. For Lenin, a war of national liberation, in contrast to wars of imperialist oppression, was merely another form of the national revolution, which in its turn enters as a necessary link in the liberating struggle of the international working class. So what Trotsky is saying here is that when a people are fighting for the independence of their nation, that is the beginning, or could possibly be the beginning, of them fighting against imperialism, capitalism, and the greater forces that hold down the working class. That's what Trotsky is trying to lay out here through Lenin's words. So, the appraisal of national wars and revolutions does not by any means imply, however, that the bourgeoisie of the colonial and semi-colonial nations have a revolutionary mission. On the contrary, the bourgeoisie of backward countries, from the days of its milk teeth, grows up as agentry of foreign capital, and notwithstanding its envious hatred of foreign capital, always does and always will in every decisive situation turn up in the same camp with it. Chinese compradorism is the classic form of the colonial bourgeoisie, and the Kuomintang is the classic party of compradorism. The upper circles of the petty bourgeoisie, including the intelligentsia, may take an active and occasionally a very noisy part in the national struggles, but they are totally incapable of playing an independent role. Only the working class standing at the head of the nation can carry either a national or an agrarian revolution clear through. The fatal mistake of the epigons, and above all Stalin, lies in this, that from Lenin's teaching about the progressive historic significance of the struggle of oppressed nations, they have inferred a revolutionary mission of the bourgeoisie of the colonial countries. A failure to understand the permanent character of revolution in an imperialist epoch, a pedantic schematization of the course of development, a chopping up of the living and combined process into dead stages imagined to be necessarily separated in time. All these errors have brought Stalin to a vulgar idealization of democracy or a democratic dictatorship, a thing which can be nothing in reality but either an imperialist dictatorship or a dictatorship of the proletariat. Step by step, Stalin's groups have proceeded along this road to a complete break with the position of Lenin on the national question and to their catastrophic policy in China. In August 1927, in conflict with the opposition, Trotsky, Rakovsky, and others, Stalin said at a plenary session of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, a revolution in imperialist countries is one thing. There, the bourgeoisie is counter-revolutionary at all stages of the revolution. A revolution in colonial and dependent countries is something else. There, the national bourgeoisie can, at a given stage and at a given date, support the revolutionary movement of their country against imperialism. With side remarks and softenings due only to his lack of confidence in himself, Stalin here transfers to the colonial bourgeoisie those same traits with which he was adorning the Russian bourgeoisie in Russia. Obedient to its deeply organic nature, Stalin's opportunism finds its way, as though impelled by some law of gravitation, through whatever channels, always in the same direction. The choice of theoretic arguments becomes here a purely accidental matter. From this transfer of his March appraisal of the provisional government to the national government of China resulted Stalin's 3-year cooperation with the Kuomintang, a policy which led up to one of the most shocking facts of modern history. In the capacity of loyal armor-bearer, the Bolshevism of the epigons accompanied the Chinese bourgeoisie right up to April 11th, 1927, the day of its bloody massacre of the Shanghai proletariat. So basically, what Trotsky is saying here is that, Stalin sent Bolshevik soldiers, Soviet soldiers, to defend the bourgeois nationalists of China, who are fighting against, the communists. This is the famous, war that, Mao Zedong eventually won to free China from Japan, but also to free China from bourgeois influence. And so here Trotsky is saying that, Stalin almost inadvertently had Mao killed because he was sending Bolshevik soldiers out there. Once again, I am not a Trotskyist. I am not a Stalinist. I am just a good red-blooded patriotic communist. American communist, baby. That's what I am. I am not picking sides here. But all I'm saying is that Trotsky is making some very, very good arguments. I do plan on reading some Stalin one day. I will read some Stalin one day. But what I'm saying here is that Trotsky is talking my black ass talk. Trotsky is talking about hypocrisy. Trotsky is talking about colonialism. He's talking about racism. And here comes Stalin, in Trotsky's words, essentially with distorted history and fetishization of the national revolution and national independence, to the point that you will even support a bourgeois national revolution over a proletariat workers revolution. What? Okay. Anyway, so from this transfer of his March appraisal of the provisional government to the national government of China resulted Stalin's 3-year cooperation with the Kuomintang, a policy which led up to one of the most shocking facts of modern history. In the capacity of his loyal armor-bearer, the Bolshevism of the Epigons accompanied the Chinese bourgeoisie right up to April 11, 1927, the day of its bloody massacre of the Shanghai proletariat. The fundamental mistake of the opposition, thus Stalin tried to justify his comradeship in arms with Chiang Kai-shek, lies in the fact that it identifies the revolution of 1905 in Russia, in an imperialist country oppressing other peoples, with the revolution in China, an oppressed country. It is astonishing even in Stalin that he has never thought of viewing the revolution in Russia not from the standpoint of the nation oppressing other peoples, but from the standpoint of the experience of these same other peoples of Russia who have suffered no less oppression than the Chinese. In that gigantic field of experience represented by Russia in the course of her 3 revolutions, you can find every variant of national and class struggle except one, that in which the bourgeoisie of any oppressed nation played a liberating role in relation to its own people. At every stage of its development, every borderland bourgeoisie, no matter in what colors it might dance, was invariably dependent upon the central banks, trust, and commercial institutions, which were in essence the agents of all Russian capital. They subjected the bourgeoisie to the Russifying movement, and subjected to the bourgeoisie broad circles of the liberal and democratic intelligentsia. The more mature a borderland bourgeoisie might be, the more closely was it bound up with the general state machine. Taken as a whole, the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation played the same role in relation to the ruling bourgeoisie that the latter played in relation to the international finance capital. The complex hierarchy of antagonisms and dependencies did not remove for one single day the fundamental solidarity of the 3 in the struggle against the insurrectionary masses. In the period of counter-revolution, 1907 to 1917, when the leadership of the national movements was in the hands of the native bourgeoisie, they were even more candid than the Russian liberals in seeking a working agreement with the Russian monarchy. The Polish, Baltic, Tatar, Ukrainian, Jewish bourgeoisie vied with each other in the display of imperialist patriotism. After the February Revolution, they hid behind the backs of the cadets, or, like the cadets, behind the backs of their own national compromisers. The bourgeoisie of the border nations entered the road of separatism in the autumn of 1917, not in a struggle against national oppression, but in a struggle against the advancing proletarian revolution. In the sum total, the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations manifested no less hostility to the revolution than the great Russian bourgeoisie. This gigantic historic lesson of 3 revolutions has left not a trace, however, in the minds of many of those who took part in the events, notably in the mind of Stalin. The compromisist, that is, petty bourgeoisie, conception of the correlation of classes within colonial nations, that conception which killed the Chinese Revolution of 1925 through 1927, has even been introduced by the Epigons into the program of the Communist International, converting this program in that section into a mere trap for the oppressed peoples of the East. Very profound right here what Trotsky is saying. Essentially that, a petty bourgeois revolution of people who are oppressed is not seeking the end of oppression of those people. For example, if our rich billionaires in Black America like Jay-Z, LeBron James, Tiger Woods, Barack Obama even, all came out and said, we need an independent nation. I agree, Barack. Yeah, we do. Yes, we really do, said Tiger Woods. Whatever. I'm bad at impressions, and it's almost 6 a.m. Anyway, if the rich billionaire black people came out like Oprah and said we need a new independent nation, let me be your leader, run, nigga, run. Run to the hills. Because what does a petty bourgeois revolution really mean? What does a petty bourgeois revolution mean when it comes from an oppressed people? This is the quiz question for the day, class. What is a petty bourgeois revolution of an oppressed people? What is it? I've said it like 3 or 4 times. If you haven't been paying attention in class, wake up. Wake up. A petty bourgeois revolution from oppressed people is when brown people or any group of people who have been oppressed, but they're very rich, they say, you know what will be great? If we could fuck our own people. That's what it is. Instead of us getting rich while other people fuck our people. That's what a petty bourgeois revolution is. And that's what Trotsky is essentially saying here, that their interest is not actually to free or liberate us. It's to actually try to stop the proletarian revolution around the door. Okay? In order to understand the real character of Lenin's policy on the national question, it is a good idea, following the method of contrast, to compare it with the policy of the Austrian Social Democrats. Bolshevism based itself upon the assumption of an outbreak of national revolutions continuing for decades to come, and instructed the advanced workers in this spirit. The Austrian social democracy, on the contrary, submissively accommodated itself to the policy of the ruling classes. It defended the compulsory co-citizenship of tens of nations in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and at the same time being absolutely incapable of achieving a revolutionary union of the workers in these different nationalities, fenced them off in the party and in the trade unions with vertical partitions. Karl Renner, an educated Habsburg functionary, was never tired of probing the inkwells of Austro-Marxism in search of some means of rejuvenating the rule of the Habsburgs, until one day he found himself the bereaved theoretician of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. When the Central Empires were crushed, the Habsburg dynasty again tried to raise the banner of a federation of autonomous nations under its scepter. The official program of the Austrian social democracy, based as it was upon the assumption of a peaceful development within the framework of the monarchy, now became in 1 second the program of the monarchy itself, covered with the bloody filth of its 4 years of war. But that rusty hoop, which had bound tens of nations together, flew to pieces. Austria-Hungary fell apart as a result of internal centrifugal tendencies reinforced by the surgery of Versailles. New states were formed, and the old ones reconstructed. The Austrian Germans hung over an abyss. Their problem was no longer to preserve their dominance over other nations, but to avoid falling themselves under a foreign yoke. And Otto Bauer, representing the left wing of the Austrian social democracy, considered this a suitable moment to bring forward the formula of national self-determination. That program, which during the preceding decades should have inspired the struggle of the proletariat against the Habsburgs and the ruling bourgeoisie, was now brought in as an instrument of self-preservation for the nation which had dominated yesterday, but today was in danger from the side of the liberated Slavic peoples. Just as the reformist program of the Austrian social democracy had become in the wink of an eye the straw at which a drowning monarchy tried to grab, so the formula of self-determination, emasculated by these Austro-Marxists, was now to become the anchor of salvation for the German bourgeoisie. On October 3rd, 1918, when the matter no longer depended on them in the slightest degree, the Social Democratic deputies of the Reichsrat magnanimously recognized the right of the peoples of the former empire to self-determination. On October 4th, the bourgeois parties had also adopted the program of self-determination. Having thus outstripped the Austro-German imperialists by 1 day, the Social Democrats immediately resumed their waiting policy, it being still uncertain what turn things would take and what Wilson was going to say. Only on the 13th of October, when the conclusive collapse of the army and the monarchy had created, in the words of Otto Bauer, the revolutionary situation for which our national program was designed, did the Austro-Marxists raise the question of self-determination in a practical form. In very truth, they had now nothing to lose. With the collapse of its rulership over other nations, explains Bauer quite frankly, the German national bourgeoisie considered at an end that historic mission in whose cause it had voluntarily suffered a separation from the German fatherland. Thus, the new program was put in circulation, not because it was needful to the oppressed, but because it had ceased to be dangerous to the oppressors. The possessing classes, driven into a tight place historically, have found themselves obliged to recognize the national revolution juridicially, and Austro-Marxism found this an appropriate moment to legitimize it theoretically. This was a mature revolution, they said, timely, historically prepared. It is all over anyway. The spirit of the social democracy is here, before us, as though in the palm of the hand. It was quite otherwise with the social revolution, which could not hope for any recognition from the possessing classes. This had to be postponed, compromised, robbed of glory, since the empire had split up along the weakest, that is, in the national seams. Otto Bauer drew the following conclusions as to the character of the revolution. It was by no means a social, but a national revolution. It was by no means a social, but a national revolution. In reality, the movement had from the very beginning a deep social revolutionary content. Its purely national character is fairly well illustrated by the fact that the possessing classes of Austria openly invited the Entente to take prisoner the whole army. The German bourgeoisie beseeched the Italian general to seize Vienna with Italian troops. This vulgar and pedantic separation of national form from social content in the revolutionary process, as though they constituted two independent historic stages, we see here how closely Otto Bauer approaches Stalin, had an extremely utilitarian destination. Let's repeat that. This vulgar and pedantic separation of national form from social content in the revolutionary process, as though they constituted two independent historic stages, we see here how closely Otto Bauer approaches Stalin, had an extremely utilitarian destination. Its purpose was to justify the collaboration of the social democracy with the bourgeoisie in its struggle against the danger of social revolution. All right. Shout out to here. We're going to put these motherfuckers out, okay? So basically what I'm getting from Trotsky right here, he's essentially saying, like, some people don't like the Bolshevik Revolution. Some people think the Bolshevik Revolution went too far, with, seizing the property from the landed gentry and the capitalists and the manufacturers, etc. Some of it might have went too far, but what could have it been? It could have been the Austro-Hungarian Social Democratic Revolution, basically, where the people who claim to be leftists and claim to be speaking for all the Austrians in this case, essentially just hijacked the revolution so that the bourgeoisie could gain power. And so what do we have in Austria today? Sure, Austria is a pretty nice country, I guess, but still there is a class of people who are able to extract vast amounts of wealth from the working class that are there. And, as we are continuing to see throughout the world, it doesn't matter what country you are in, it's getting harder and harder and harder for working class people to live. And that includes Austria as well. There's no such thing as, no homelessness, nobody struggling with bills, nobody actually, being able to have all of their needs met and still save money in this capitalist economy. Doesn't matter where you are. Doesn't matter where you are, and Austria is included, okay? So yeah, I will continue here. If you adopt the formula of Marx, that revolution is the locomotive of history, then Austro-Marxism occupies the position of the brake. Even after the actual collapse of the monarchy, the social democracy, called to participate in the government, was still unable to make up its mind to a rupture with the old Habsburg ministry. The national revolution limited itself to reinforcing the old ministers with state secretaries. Only after October 9th, when the German Revolution had thrown out the Hohenzollern, did the Austrian Social Democrats propose to the State Council that they proclaim a republic, frightening their bourgeois partners into it with the movement of the masses, at which they were already themselves quaking to the marrow of their bones. The Christian Socialist, says Otto Bauer, with imprudent irony, who on the 9th and 10th of November were still on the side of the monarchy, decided on November 11th to cease their resistance. For 2 whole days, the Social Democrats were in advance of the party of the Black Hundred monarchy. All the heroic legends of humanity grow pale before this revolutionary audacity. Against its will, the Austrian social democracy took its place automatically from the beginning of the revolution at the head of the nation, just as had the Russian Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. Like them, too, it feared above all things its own power. In the coalition government, the Social Democrats tried to occupy just as small a place as possible. Otto Bauer explains this as follows. The fact that the Social Democrats at first demanded only a modest participation in the government corresponded primarily to the purely national character of the revolution. The question of power was decided by those people, not on a basis of the real correlation of forces, the might of the revolutionary movement, the bankruptcy of the ruling classes, the political influence of the party, but by a pedantic little label, purely national revolution, pasted by some wiseacre classifiers upon the actual course of events. Karl Renner waited out the storm in the position of head secretary of the State Council. The other Social Democratic leaders converted themselves into assistants of the bourgeois ministers. In other words, the Social Democrats hid under the office tables. The masses, however, were not satisfied to feed on the national shell of that nut whose social meat the Austro-Marxists were saving up for the bourgeoisie. The workers and soldiers shoved out the bourgeois ministers and compelled the Social Democrats to come out of hiding. The irreplaceable theoretician Otto Bauer explains this also. Only the events of the following days, driving the national revolution over to the side of social revolution, increased our weight in the government. To translate this into intelligible language, under the assault of the masses, the Social Democrats were compelled to crawl out from under the tables. But this did not change their function for a moment. They took the power, but only to start a war against romanticism and adventurism, with which titles these sycophants now designated that same social revolution which had increased their weight in the government. If these Austro-Marxists successfully fulfilled in 1918 their historic mission as guardian angels protecting the Vienna Krendienstalt from the revolutionary romanticism of the proletariat, it is only because they met no obstacle from the side of a genuine revolutionary party. Okay? So, Red Hand Inc. 1789 is, I think he's coming in here to disengage us from the text, to not actually deal with our actual topic. That's a stupid person. Okay, this is Red Hand Inc. is a stupid person because he did not read the prompt. Read the prompt, deal with the text. You can find the text we are reading by clicking the description of the video. But if you come in here and just start texting away, you will instantly be sent to the re-education camp or the gulag. Read the pinned comment. Click the video link description and you will see what we are reading very fucking clearly. What Trotsky is saying here is very interesting. He's saying that Austro-Marxism essentially is reformist and revisionist in nature. And it's not actually seeking to speak for the proletariat. And once again, I think Trotsky is laying out this point of, what does a bad national self-determination movement look like if leftists or communists are involved in it? The good one is the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks are trying to keep up with the demands of the Russian people and also speaking towards national self-determination of the various ethnic groups within Russia. A bad one would be like what happened here, where essentially the socialists in name essentially assist the bourgeoisie, into creating their own sort of state. Okay, so once again, the question for the audience today is: should all people have the right to self-determination? If that is so, if all people deserve the right to self-determination, do indigenous Americans and Black Americans deserve the right to self-determination to create free, sovereign, socialist states within the United States? Answer that question. This is the question to the audience. Anybody who answers that question will have their comments read. So I repeat, should Black Americans and Indigenous Americans be able to freely create sovereign socialist states within the United States? That is the question for the audience. Answer it and your comment will be read. Continuing here, Trotsky says, the two states composed of nationalities, Russian and Austro-Hungary, have their most recent fate set a seal upon the difference between Bolshevism and Austro-Marxism. Throughout a decade and a half, Lenin, in implacable conflict with all shades of great Russian chauvinism, preached the rights of all oppressed nations to cut away from the empire of the czars. The Bolsheviks were accused of aspiring toward the dismemberment of Russia, but this bold revolutionary formulation of the national problem won for the Bolshevik Party the indestructible confidence of the small and oppressed peoples of Tsarist Russia. In April 1917, Lenin said, "If the Ukrainians see that we have a Soviet republic, they will not cut away, but if we have a Milikov republic, they will." In this, he proved right. History has proved an incomparable check-up of the two policies of the national question. Whereas Austria-Hungary, whose proletariat was educated in the spirit of a cowardly halfway policy, went all to pieces under a formidable shakeup. And moreover, the initiative in this process was taken in the main by the national sections of the Social Democratic Party. In Russia, on the ruins of Tsarism, a new state composed of nationalities has been formed. It has been closely welded together, both economically and politically, by the Bolshevik Party. Whatever it may be the furthest destiny of the Soviet Union, and it is still far from a quiet haven, the national policy of Lenin will find its place among the eternal treasures of mankind. Okay? So, very interesting here. Very interesting what Trotsky has said. That's the end of chapter 38. That is a vitally important chapter. Very important chapter. Beautifully written chapter. I really loved it. It was very, very good. It's brought me a lot of food for thought to think about. It really, gives me encouragement that, one day we will be able to all be free and we will be able to organize and be in communities that are loving, caring, and also with people that share our values, our culture, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll be in a socialist world where we are, free from the bonds of the forced sort of cohabitation and hierarchical structures that we live with now, to better be able to exchange, trade, do business, and meet people upon our own terms. You get what I'm saying? Like, within national self-determination, there is a sort of, pride. Like I said before, I didn't feel pride for a nation before. But as I continue to think about it, if it's formulated right and if we have the right messaging, I could see myself, becoming more, nationalistic in that sense. You know what I'm saying? But that's all I got to say. We have finished chapter 38. If you have any comments or questions for me, put it in the text, put it in the chat, and we will try to read it. Let's close up the polls right here. So, all nations have a right to self-determination with 5 votes. We have 40% yes, 40% no. Unsure but fuck Trump with 20%. That's 5 votes. Very interesting results right here. I thought that would be more popular. Let's see what it is over here in the vertical live stream, what the results are. All right, let's see. All right. So here we have, I can't see the results here. Hold on. Let's see the results in the vertical live stream. I'm waiting for it to pull up right now. Hold on. Okay. So, all nations have a right to self-determination. 48% with yes. unsure, but fuck Trump and MAGA with 28% and no with 24%. I like those results. I'm always surprised because the fascists, the racists, the white supremacists show up in the vertical live stream. Yet and still, the poll results always seem to make me happy. They always seem to make me very happy, and I'm happy to see that, okay? So we're going to wrap up this live stream. It was a pleasure to have you all here. I'll come on live later today, hopefully, to read chapter 39. It's about 6 a.m. where I'm at, so we're going to go to sleep right now and wrap it up. Shout out to my commissar, Kirkham Down Stalin, for joining the live stream. Shout out to Super Kripke. Shout out to JMH Psalm. Shout out to OG Kicks, Universe of Gray. What else? And that's it. Y'all be easy out there. All power to the people, and peace.